Startup. I'm Julien Newman.
And I'm Chris Yeh. Glad to be here this week.
Yeah, well, Chris, you are, I believe you have been in Palo Alto all week for the first time in a long time.
That is correct. I was in my hometown, my adopted hometown, this entire week. I don't even know if I drove outside the city limits of Palo Alto during this entire week.
Well, that's impressive for you because you're always very jet set.
Yes. And again, this is not going to last. Next week, I will definitely at least be going to visit Berkeley once, and then the week after that, down to Los Angeles, and then another 2 weeks after that, down to Los Angeles again, and then things start to pick up again, as they often do. But
Why?
it's nice to have a respite.
What are you doing at Berkeley? It's my wife's alma mater, or whatever people call us say.
So it's not to do with the university. So I'm taking my daughter to visit a startup that is in the alternative protein space. It's
Okay.
called Prime Roots, and what they do is they make alternative proteins using mycelium, so basically fungus. And so my daughter's very interested in sustainability and vegetarianism and veganism. And I happen to know the CEO, who's a wonderful, wonderful woman. So I thought it would be a good opportunity for her to, meet a strong female role model.
I was vegetarian from the age of 12 until like around when I was 18, when I started doing sports more seriously.
Yeah,
And
that makes it a little harder.
it was impossible. So it's funny, I had a trainer and he was kind of like pushing me to eat more protein. It was, impossible to keep up. And then I lived in Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada, and it was rib week. So they had all these ribs, and I ate like 2 racks of ribs as my first kind of recovery from vegetarianism, and I haven't looked back.
There you go. Well, I mean, I think it is possible, provided you have the right sort of supply chain. So something like tofu, for example, actually is fairly high in protein. So if you get not the regular sort of tofu that you often see, which is the soft form and not really compact, really full of water, but you get the baked form, that's actually sufficient. You could probably eat enough of it. And of course, the sumo wrestlers of Japan are athletes, and oftentimes they consume a primarily vegetarian diet. But nonetheless, the stuff that you can find in a regular American or Canadian grocery store would make it more difficult.
Yeah, well, you may not know this about me, but I was a big, let's say, the main shopper at the local health food store when I was a kid, because I had a ton of allergies.
Oh my.
And they all went away somehow. But I couldn't drink milk, so I had soy milk back when soy milk tasted like crap. And
It's greatly improved now.
Yeah.
But by the way, the soy milk you got from Chinese markets always tasted fine.
Yes.
It's just it was impossible to get at a regular market.
And I'd eat, like, I couldn't have wheat or so all the gluten-free stuff. Like, I'd have all that stuff when I was growing up. And I worked in my first. I had a bunch of like odd jobs I created for myself, just like servicing my neighbors. But the first kind of actual job I had was working in the bulk section of that health food store, which was, I think, my favorite job of my life. It was so much fun, just like packing nuts into bins.
Something very satisfying about that. And of course, I do like nuts quite a bit.
Okay, so we have a topic for this week.
A topic which our Patreon subscribers found out about before I did. And in fact, I guarantee they found out about before I did, because I don't think I bothered to read the email this time.
You almost never bother to read my emails, but regardless of that, the Patreon people do get it anyways before you receive it, a few days before. And the Patreon is patreon.com/blitzscaling. And the topic broadly is how to think of building startups for non-existing markets.
Okay.
An example that I think that you'd have exposure to and knowledge of, and that everyone would know of, is Airbnb. Where it's like, obviously there's a hotel market that exists,
Right.
but is there a kind of like people staying at other people's homes market? I mean, there was, but how are you supposed to know that from the outset?
Yeah.
So that's kind of like an obvious success story. The other one that I'm very familiar with, because they're from Montreal and their founder CEO has the same name as me, is Breather. Have you heard of that company, Breather?
I have heard of Breather. They're the place where you go to rent basically recharging space. So if I am in a downtown area and I don't want to be able to get back to my home or there's no time, I can rent a space on Breather and I can take a nap or just relax.
Correct. And their idea was, hey, how about we create office space for people who don't need office space,
Hmm.
right? So it's kind of like, let's say, a choir group that, just needs an office. Like they wouldn't get co-working space, they wouldn't have an office, but
Yeah.
they might want to meet, or a yoga teacher. So it's just like, the customers who would not buy from normal, like they wouldn't sign a lease, and they wouldn't even purchase from WeWork, but they do need office space once in a while. I mean, example that might be like if I didn't have an office and I want to record a podcast, maybe I want to rent a Breather once a week. And they were nice. Like they first opened in Montreal, and I used to use them. Back when I didn't have an office, and I
Hmm.
was their target customer. In the end, that market didn't exist. It wasn't a real market. I mean, it was a very, very niche market. Um, and somehow it's kind of like obvious it didn't exist as a market. But then again, it would seem obvious, like if Airbnb hadn't worked out, that their market didn't exist as a market. So the question is kind of, how do you know if like if it's obvious that all markets that don't exist, then how do you know when they do exist?
Right. So that is an interesting thing. And a bunch of thoughts immediately began swirling in my mind. And I think that there are markets that don't exist that are easier to believe will exist than others. And so let's start with the simplest and dumbest, but often quite effective way of doing this, which is to say there is an existing market and it sucks. And if you can figure out a way to make that market better, that existing market will largely change over to what you're doing. And the classic example of this is ride hailing. There was an existing taxi market. It was very big and it was terrible. And it was bad for everyone except for the people who were lucky enough to be issued taxi medallions. And so when you look at that, you say, well, let's see, will the government defend this taxi medallion monopoly? And the answer is no, because there are many, many more voters who would say, screw that, than there are taxi owners who would say, hey, I'm willing to donate a lot of money to your political campaign. And so the ride hailing is a classic example of a market where you're like, okay, this doesn't exist, but it clearly should. And the main thing you have to overcome in the case of an Uber or Lyft was to be able to get to the point where there was sufficient liquidity, which they achieved by massively subsidizing the rides early on and focusing on city by city rollouts. And the very natural concern that your drivers could be psychopaths and criminals who then kidnap, murder, or otherwise harm their riders. And the fact is that really doesn't happen that often, right? People have ratings and things like that. And also, it's pretty obvious if this person got on the thing and then disappeared, who the hell was responsible. So that was a fear that people had that really didn't make as much sense because, again, anybody who actually did perpetrate a crime would be heading to jail relatively quickly. Didn't stop a few people from doing it. And it also hasn't stopped crazy people from shooting their Uber drivers, by the way. There was an incident recently down in the border, I think in Mexico, where one Uber rider who perhaps had listened to too much Fox News literally shot her Uber driver because she thought he was trying to kidnap her when he was just taking her to her destination. So very sad stuff. But there are other markets which might be more difficult. So, for example, the Airbnb market is not as clear. So, the hotel market existed for a long time, very mature, with a lot of different players covering the entire spectrum. ranging from the very inexpensive bare bones hotels all the way up to the absurdly expensive 5-star resort hotels. And at no point in time would anyone would have said, oh gosh, this is insufficient and terrible. In fact, it's pretty good. And I would say that when I travel, I still often will use hotels as opposed to Airbnb. And a lot of it depends on a couple of scenarios. So, why is it that Airbnb can beat hotels in certain circumstances? It's by going after specific markets that the hotels aren't as suited for. So, the first market is leisure travelers. Business travelers don't have as much price sensitivity. And more importantly, they have far less tolerance for variation. So, business traveler goes to stay somewhere. They want a reliable bed, reliable Wi Fi, reliable location, reliable everything. They're not there to take in the local scenery or atmosphere. And so, the Airbnb argument that you should live like a local has nothing to appeal to business travelers.
Right.
And I generally will stay in a hotel for business travel because it is just easier. But leisure travel is a different story. And with leisure travel, all of a sudden, things that would be annoyances, variability, uncertainty, become part of the excitement. And so that's one of the elements of Airbnb. The other element of Airbnb is hotels are very, very focused on renting out individual rooms. And that's great for a business traveler. But I can tell you, if you're traveling with your family, a single hotel room is not enough. And the gigantic suites that are available are way too expensive. Or if you're going to be staying someplace who are traveling in larger groups, people who are traveling for larger periods served by the hotel market.
So I think what you're saying, and tell me if I got it wrong, is, yes, on one hand, it's true that Airbnb is creating a new market of renting from people's homes.
Right.
But on the other hand, they're also not creating a new market. They are expanding an existing market of hotels which target non-business travelers.
That's right. And people who are even beginning to target, different kinds of travel, because a business trip is typically short term, whereas leisure travel might be longer term. So, for example, Julien, you're there in Thailand. You're not staying in a hotel right now.
Correct.
That's because you're there for longer. I mean, you could stay in a hotel, but I think you probably decided for a variety of reasons, not just limited to cost, that you would rather have an apartment.
So, okay. So I get that if that's how you should think about it. You shouldn't be trying to create a market. You should be trying to expand a market. And you should say,
well, you could get to the point where you try to create market. That's what we'll talk about next. But expanding a market or converting a market or serving a specific use case that is not currently well served by what appears to be a saturated market, these are all different ways you could go about creating this new market.
Right. And that's like you are creating a market, but you're creating a market by kind of like expanding from an existing market. Right. Like, let's say you're doing space travel for leisure. I mean, that doesn't exist. I mean, it kind of does because of, Richard Branson's thing or whatever it is.
Right.
But let's say before that, like, it just didn't exist as a category, and Richard Branson's, whatever they're called, Virgin Galactic, created that, obviously. But they're also, in a way, expanding the kind of like high-end, extremely high-end kind of adventure travel that
Correct.
Four Seasons does. Like, they have these kind of like weird jets that you can go off and explore a bunch of different countries.
And it's also the case, by the way, that Virgin Galactic is largely unsuccessful because of one of the problems that often afflicts people who are trying to create new markets, which is wealthy entrepreneurs often forget that they are not a real market.
Yeah. Well, okay, I did want to ask you about, I did want to kind of like dig into the breather example and see how
Hmm.
it would link into this. But this is something that I've been thinking about, and I want to, the proverbial double click into
Right.
what you just said there, where so I've been thinking a lot about new market creation and like
Hmm.
other places people have created markets, and specifically, as you know, I've been researching Taobao Live.
Yes.
One of the things I realized about Taobao Live, and it's hard to get any information about like its history, but I have eventually found it. It started off, so it's live commerce for people who don't
Yes.
know, in China, and the thing that I found is that it started off as a product that appealed to and was built for like third tier cities in China. And that kind of like fits into this pattern that is counterintuitive to
Right.
you and me.
Large but overlooked.
Correct. So it's kind of like a premium service for low end customers. Seems to be like a pretty reliable pattern for new market creation. Is there something there, or how like
Yeah, so
expand on that?
let's talk about that. And I'll circle back to breather as well because I want to make sure we don't forget about it. So I think that one of the ways to look at this is to look at it through the lens of classic disruptive innovation, Clay Christensen, The Innovator's Dilemma, and the like. And what happens in these higher end products for lower end markets is very classic disruption from below. So instead of trying to serve the current customers, you go down market, but you serve them with a solution that is close to what the market actually has right now. So you're providing a premium service or less. And we saw this even in the airline industry, right? JetBlue came into a ridiculously mature industry and was able to carve out and become one of the larger carriers here in the United States by saying, hey, you know what? We're going to create a premium economy experience. We're going to have leather seats. We're going to have live television. Instead of forcing you to wait for our flight attendants to give you food, we're going to trust that the food is not that expensive. We're just going to keep the snacks in a little locker thing, and you can go and get as many snacks as you want. Because guess what? Who the hell actually wants to eat that many chips? And that was super
Me,
successful.
I would
Correct.
always abuse a JetBlue snack.
Yeah, but you were one of many,
I
many
was always the only
passengers.
one on the plane to do it. It's true.
Exactly. And I did absolutely grab snacks. I mean, when they have the kinds of low carb snacks that I'm looking for. So that's an example. I agree that that is a pattern. Being able to create new products that being able to create new products that provide a experience that is akin to some of these premium products, but at a lower price point. Absolutely makes sense. I'm pausing since right now I don't see Julien. I'm afraid that his internet connection has gone down, so I'll have to wait for him to come back. But in the meantime, just because it might be fun to record a few things, because I'm sitting here anyways, let me offer my talk about breather so that we have this recorded. So the issue that breather ran into is basic math. You would have to say, what is the percentage of people at any given time who want to use this product? Breather. There you go.
Yeah.
If you weren't able to come back, I was going to deliver a monologue about breather.
So yeah, I was back, but somehow I wasn't. You couldn't see me, so and also I have us on my laptop, and I couldn't see me. So I reloaded the
Got
what
it.
happened there.
Good.
Okay, so but because the Airbnb example is an example of offering a premium service to a low end market.
Is it? Is it really a premium service or is it offering a different service?
Right, right. But it's going after a low, like there's this.
It is
into
going after a market that people did not really focus on as much. So in the hotel industry, as you intuited, just like in the airline industry, the focus is on the business customer. That's where the majority of the money comes from. And there are hotels that focus on the leisure customer just because, you might as well pick up that money, but the business traveler is far more lucrative. And the same holds true third tier cities in China or leisure flyers and so on and so forth.
because my intuition is, and I think this is true for most of the people I know, that you're better off, like if you're trying to create a new market
Mhm.
or whatever, expand a market, you're better off going after a high-end market because, well, probably the actual reason is that I am the high-end market and I just empathize with that. But the kind of rationalization is that those people have more money, and it's kind of like Tesla. Um, Tesla is kind of like the example people would use.
Right.
But I think in most cases, that's actually like most people who do that fail. I think there's a company that was in New York that was super popular when I first moved there that just had like a butler service for your home. There was like an
Hmm.
app. That was
Hmm.
back when like everything was Uber for X. And it was like Uber for butlers at your home to like serve you. Only obnoxious people would use that. But um, while there are a lot more examples of, let's say Airbnb is a lower end version,
Yeah.
IKEA is lower end, like it does seem like a more common pattern that people start by giving a better service, differentiated or higher end or whatever, to a lower end use case. Is that
Yes, I
accurate?
think that's right. And I think that has happened a lot because of the increasing size of the middle class across the world, which means that people who previously were not economic to serve have become economic to serve. And I think we can look at this in terms of discount groceries, discount retailing, all these different things. If you visit a modern discount grocery store or someplace like that, you go to an Aldi, you would say, well, this is so much better than some random crappy bodega of some kind, right? It's not that the people have fewer demands. It's just that people historically have said, well, it's not worth it. And therefore, just bad competitors can sweep up that money. If instead you say, no, actually, through technology or better operations, I can actually serve this market with a decent product and make money, then I will come in and sweep this competition out in front of me because this competition is bad and lazy.
Yeah, it sounds to me like, just hearing what you said there, that the actual pattern is you want to serve an underserved market. And then
Yes.
the high-end markets tend to be not underserved because all the CEOs are part of the high-end market, and all the executives are part of the high-end market, all the investors are part of the high-end market. And also, those are just higher margin, higher price tag items, and it just makes sense to go after
Right.
them as a large company that's trying to make money, or even as a startup who's trying to make money at the gate. While there are a lot of dynamics that make it so that the lower end markets just end up getting underserved by the force of things. Like, is that the right takeaway?
I think that's right. I think that people underestimate the lower end markets and they forget that the lower end market of today may be the middle class market of tomorrow. That there is change going on constantly, demographic change, technological change, and so on and so forth. And by the way, one of the reasons why we get so used to products coming in at the high end and then going downwards is because of the fact that we're used to thinking about technology products. So when the iPhone came out, it was much more expensive than previous phones. When the Macintosh came out, it was much more expensive than previous computers, and so on and so forth. But technology products have the benefit of being able to have dramatic reductions in cost thanks to economies of scale and Moore's law. And so there is a natural path to go from high end market to mass market. Whereas with non technology products, that's not really so clear. If you build a high end hotel, it doesn't necessarily follow that over time, the cost of that hotel is going to
Right.
decline by 90% and then be available to everyone.
So an example of that, I mean, Tesla is an example of that, but an example of that doesn't exist is, I think this is an area you've been interested in, Chris, just like alternative energy stuff. So like small nuclear power plants and stuff like that. So like you wouldn't build a micro nuclear power plant for the low end market because it's going to be really expensive. But then as you get
Right.
to mass production, so you'd sell them to, let's say, governments who want to have electricity for each building.
Or the U.S. military,
Yeah.
where having the ability to supply electricity without having to have a giant supply chain of fossil fuels is helpful.
And
And
it's kind of like,
so there are customers that are willing to pay quite a bit for a differentiated product.
and yeah, right. So you'd go after them, people for whom like cost is not really a problem. And then as you work out the kinks, you would then,
Correct.
get cheaper and go lower end. And maybe everyone, including me, would have a nuclear power plant in my home or something like that.
Right. Now let's talk about Breather for a second, because I want to make sure we don't forget about that one. So why is it that Breather did not have a large enough market? And I think it's basically you just got to sit down and ask yourself, okay, how big is the market for office space for people who don't have offices? By definition, if they don't have offices, they're going to be occasional users. And it's a niche market. Most people are not in that particular situation. So you have a niche market where, as opposed to an office building, which people use all the time, is only going to be used once a week, once a month, or something like that. So you've naturally painted yourself into a smaller market. That's the problem with something like that. You're making a bet that the fundamental way people work is going to change, and that in the future there won't be office buildings and everyone will co-work or work from home, and that these breathers will be used multiple times a week. But that's not a good bet.
See, the challenge I have, like like all this stuff is obvious, in
In
retrospect.
retrospect,
But the challenge I have is I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of founding that company, right? And all these things could be said about Airbnb. Like they do fall within the right pattern, right? So they are going after a lower, like they're giving a premium service, the
yeah,
lower end, underserved segment of the market. And then the objections you'd have to it, like, hey, look, these are occasional users and customers, so it's not a real thing. That would also be true for Airbnb, right? So it's like, look, business travelers, they travel every week.
so
These
here's the key, right? So there is a large enough leisure travel market. And you're not saying we're picking off a small segment of the leisure travel market. We're picking off the main chunk of the leisure travel market. So the fact is that audience is an occasional user, but that occasional usage is enough to represent one of the major markets available in the global
Mhm.
economy.
Right. So office space rental, let's say, is a broad category of breathers in. There just aren't that many leasers of office space, right? I mean, there are a lot, but it's not like, let's say, groceries,
Right.
right? And while, hotels are probably used by like 80% of people. Like,
That's right.
so I mean, it's not groceries, but it's close. So a lot of the arguments that would lead you to believe like, hey, look, these guys are just traveling once a year. So how big of a market is this really? Don't apply or get kind of like over like they don't matter as much because there're just so many people, and then you can find adjacent niches and kind of sequence into
Correct.
them.
Right. Airbnb was replacing leisure hotels, which was not really a thing, but there were, many billions of dollars every year being spent on that. Whereas Breather, what is it replacing? It's replacing not having something. And how many people are in that particular situation? By the way, there's a lesson to be learned from the iPhone as well, which we mentioned briefly. So if you think about the iPhone, again, it's a similar kind of thing. What is going on with the iPhone? Are people buying the iPhone to have that as a phone? And the answer is clearly not. Right?
Right.
The iPhone is not actually particularly good for making phone calls. And what Steve Jobs correctly identified and had exquisite timing on was the belief that the purpose of phones was about to shift from making phone calls to being mobile computers. And he created an iPhone that was optimized for being a mobile computer, right? If you want to make phone calls, having physical keys is much better. If you want to make phone calls, having a smaller form factor is much better. These are all things the Apple iPhone did not have. But if you are looking for a way to browse the internet and use a computer while you're on the move, the iPhone is clearly the right choice.
Right. So the
And so they,
iPhone, yeah, the iPhone market's actually the laptop market.
correct. And so what happened was people realized, hey, this is actually, or Apple, I suspect, realized we are not trying to displace telephone usage. We are trying to get people even more excited about an adjacent market, which is to say a mobile computer that they can use at any time, not just like when a laptop they can, well, laptops are mobile, but they're essentially mobile and fixed. Nobody walks around holding a laptop.
So, okay, just before I say this, we have a question from Franklin,
Ooh, a
and I
question.
just want to tell him that we'll answer this shortly. But I want to ask you this question. Uh, okay, it sounds like the actual challenge is
Yes.
to know what your real market is. Really,
Yes.
that's the core thing. So, what Breather missed and what Apple with the iPhone and what Airbnb and et cetera, got right is that they're able to identify what their actual market was. And that's, I think, a really, really difficult thing to do. And my understanding is that at LinkedIn, that's something that they struggled a lot with, like figuring out like what's our market who are our
Correct.
competitors, like is Facebook a competitor, et cetera, et cetera.
Correct.
So am I getting that right? And then, can you expand on that if I am?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think that figuring out what your true market is, and this involves not listening to a bunch of industry analysts and putting up a bunch of charts from Forrester or Gartner, but rather sitting down and thinking very carefully through what is it that people actually do. And that's the thing about the iPhone, right? With the iPhone, there are all these people who are skeptical, so this is never going to work. And the existing phones are so powerful, and Nokia is such a powerful company, and all these different things. But the fact of the matter is, you could say, well, what are people going to be doing in the future? What is the phone of the future going to look like? And is it primarily going to be used for making phone calls? And clearly, the world was already moving away from that. I mean, we could see that just in the sense that we were getting away from charging people per minute to all you can eat for phone calls, right? It had been determined that making money off of the phone calls was no longer going to work. I mean, the information was already out there.
So the question you need to ask yourself, and this is something I found often when you get to like a deep level on topics, which is like you have to ask yourself, like think about it from the customer's perspective, and you have to ask yourself, what will people actually use this for? What will actual people actually use this for, and how do they do this today?
Yes.
Not what category do I fall into, like all that. I mean, it's that's what we've been saying, but it's just wrong. You have to say, why would anyone use an iPhone? Why would anyone stay in an Airbnb? And like actually, right?
Yeah.
And then what are they doing today for that same reason? Because they are like, if there's a need to use an Airbnb, they're already doing it. And how are they doing it?
That's right. And that's why it's so important to remember that thinking about a market in terms of market projection, market share, and all that cloaks the fact that the market is the aggregate of individual purchasing or adoption decisions being made by actual human beings. And so it's really important to actually think about the individual human being. If you can't think of an individual human being adopting a product, it doesn't matter if you have a projection that says that that product's going to achieve 10% market share. That's absurd. If no individual would choose it, then it's not going to be chosen en masse.
And the challenge, so getting back to breather, so you should have just asked yourself, like, hey, who's using this who would actually use this? It doesn't matter like who is using it. It's like once this is built out, who would use this?
Right. And so you might do something which, is a classic sort of management consulting thing, but just because management consultants do it doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. You could say, well, let's take the city of Palo Alto, just to make it easy. It's a city of about 100,000 people. Out of those 100,000 people, how many people in that city at a given day would need to use a breather? Or how often would the average person use a breather? And you would say, well, how often would I use one? And you might say, how often have I used one in the past? How excited am I to use a new one? And I'm like, well, might use it, once a month. Okay, once a month. All right, in a city of 100,000, that's once a month. And then what's the size of the transaction? Well, it's like, $20. Oh, okay. And it's smaller than a hotel room, right? I don't think anyone was proposing, and you used Breather. I don't think you were paying $200 a session with Breather.
Correct. It's
Right?
like,
Single digit
it
dollars.
has to be cheap. Otherwise you just get co-working for a month.
Exactly. So like $10, $20. Okay. So a city of Palo Alto, one of the wealthiest in the world. And, a lot of people aren't working, so they wouldn't bother with it anyway. So let's assume it's half the people, 50,000. And assuming you captured all of it and they used it once a month, that would be spending 500,000. And then, you would have a take rate because you're not getting it all. So let's say you have a 10% take rate. So it's like, okay, so from a city like Palo Alto, you could get, if everything went right, you could get $50,000 a month in revenue. And then you would say, okay, so essentially what I'm saying is I can get 50 cents per user per month in revenue in one of the world's richest cities. All right. What's the population of the United States? And now we're starting to say, so we got everyone in the United States to adopt it. It's probably, 20 or $30 million a month. That's good, but I'm not going to get everyone in the United States to adopt this. I mean, it's just not going to get big enough versus what I know is the amount that people currently spend on office space or the amount that they spend on hotels or what have you.
So what you said is what ended up being the reality, right? Like incontestably, like with hindsight, we know that's the case.
Yeah.
But like here, like the thing is, I wasn't in their investor conversations, but I'm sure investors going to raise this thing. And then their answer was, yeah, you think so, but the data says otherwise. And they actually had traction data that would show that people would use it more often, blah, blah. And the reason that data was like that, I suspect, because I was an early user, so I kind of like can think of myself, like I can think of my own behavior, is it's actually kind of cool to use them at first, and then you kind of get bored. So it's like, oh, a cool space that I can rent, and I don't currently have a space. And like you'll rent it like every week for the first few months because you think it's really cool, and then you just give up, and you're like, actually, I should just get WeWork, or whatever. I'm kind of bored of this. I'll just meet in a Starbucks. And so it's very easy to get confused by the data. So you're reading the data wrong, and you're incentivized to read the data wrong.
Of course, because you're excited. You're looking to build something. And again, there is value to something like Breather. It's just not large enough to support a venture-backed company.
So it's kind of like, so the thing about market creation, right, is you shouldn't really think of it as market creation. You should think of it as expanding an underserved market. So that's the first thing.
Right.
Second thing is,
or serving latent demand. How about that? That's another possibility, latent demand. Because you could say, gee, here it is, it's 2007. How much would people be willing to use the internet if they could use it when they were on the move, wherever they were, as opposed to just when they were sitting at a computer? And the answer was a lot, because it's demonstrable that the internet is one of the most addictive substances ever created.
The second rule is the second rule is I forgot what I was going to say. All right, let's
Oh,
skip
okay.
over that because
No, let's answer the question. So the
yeah.
question being asked was from Franklin, who said, "Would you have invested in Breather?" And the answer is no. And the reason is that as an individual investor and as an angel investor, you have to keep in mind the fact that if you want to get a decent return, you're going to have to eventually attract venture investment. And looking at something like Breather, I would have said there's no way this will ever get big enough to make the venture capitalists truly excited about it. And sooner or later, this is just going to turn into either a lifestyle business or go out of business. And that's not something I'm interested in investing in.
Okay. So thank you, Franklin, for having asked this question and let me remember what it is I was going to say. So the three rules that I've kind of sussed out from here is one, expand an existing market, don't create a new market, which really means to kind of identify latent demand or find a segment
Or
of the market
underserved demand,
that's
either latent or underserved.
And then the second one is figure out what your actual market is.
Yes.
And the starting point needs to be, what are people doing? Why are they with this product, and why are they doing it? And how are they doing it today without me?
Correct. And
And
that
then
means not using the definitions from some analyst firm, but really thinking about what it is human beings are actually doing, and most importantly, paying money for.
right. And the hard thing is, why are they doing this, right? So let's say for Breather, it's like people are just doing meetings, like just randomly. So it's like, what's your actual market? Your actual market is just people meeting up at Starbucks,
Yes.
maybe. And right, like that's the actual market. The actual market, you're not in the Regis, WeWork, or commercial real estate market. You're in the people bumming off Starbucks market.
Yeah.
That's your actual market. And if
Right.
that's your actual market, well, I mean, that's not a great market.
Yeah. I'll give you an example. One of the companies that competes with Breather, I think it still competes with Breather, assuming Breather still exists, is Liquid Space. Liquid Space is an American company. It's been around for a long time, venture backed, never been that enormously successful. I was a heavy user of Liquid Space before the pandemic. Now, how was I a heavy user of Liquid Space before the pandemic? I would use Liquid Space to book time and conference rooms at the various public libraries in Palo Alto. And they were free. So Liquid Space was making exactly $0 off of me, but I was a heavy user and presumably contributed to the traction numbers that they had. Now, I haven't used Liquid Space in a long time. Why is that? Well, first of all, there was the pandemic. But the second thing is, it turns out that the real reason that I was at those public libraries all the time was because I didn't have my own office at home, and I didn't have a place to charge my electric car at home. And so I went to the library for those things. And I would be at the library, and so it was just more convenient to meet people at the library. It was nice to just get a private conference room. It was pretty cool. In contrast, now I do all my meetings, just as you've described, at the local cafe, which I can walk to in 90 seconds from my house. And if the library was there in 90 seconds away, would I book free conference rooms? Yeah, I probably would, but it's not. And
Yeah.
so that shows you just how basically inelastic the demand I have is. I'm like, yeah, if it were completely convenient, I were already there, I would do it. But if not, I'm not going to. And that is a terrible thing to build a company around.
So that's actually a good segue into the third rule that I sussed out, which is just don't lie to yourself.
Yeah.
Don't let the data lie to you. And this is, to go back to last week's conversation, like one of the kind of like biases that we have, which is we kind of like lie to ourselves to confirm what we already believe, which as entrepreneurs, our business is great and people love it. So it's expand a market, don't create a market, know what your actual market is, and then don't lie to yourself.
Yeah. It's all
are the
about,
keys of creating a new market.
exactly. It's all about really sticking close to reality. And I would add one corollary for investors, which is wealthy investors are not a real market unless you're specifically selling them an investment product, right? Wealthy investors as a market for a consumer product, terrible market, not enough of them. And it's this effect that's caused so many over the years. Uber, for response to that, is you should probably actually talk to people in the real world now and then and understand what it's like out there, because most people are not worried about, hey, can I get Uber for helicopters, and saying, oh, wow, I'm able to book a 20-minute helicopter flight for only $300 instead of the $1,000 it normally is. That's fantastic.
That's a really interesting thing, and I've found this for myself, which is that the more, like, it's not so much like the older I get, it's like the more advanced I get in my career,
Mm-hmm.
the more my day to day has nothing to do with everybody else,
That's right.
and I start valuing things that nobody else cares about. And the obvious one is time, right? Like, obviously, everybody cares more about money than time. Like, that just is truth. Like, people will drive hours to go to Walmart to save $5, which to me is insane. Like,
Right. They probably actually spent more on gas to get there than they
yeah,
saved on the shopping. But they don't see the money, right? People don't think to themselves, every mile that I drive costs me 30 cents.
yeah.
Instead, they're like, oh, I filled up last week, and so now it doesn't count.
That's it. Like, so for me, I go to the gym not because I want to look good. I go to the gym because I want to have a high energy level.
Right.
And that's how I see it. And it's just like, it's totally true that that is how I see it.
Yeah, but that's not the reason most people are at the gym.
Yeah, nobody goes to the gym for that reason. Like, I'm the only one at my gym, I'm sure, who goes to the gym for that reason. And presumably, like, I'm 34, right? So I'm not, as advanced in my career as you are, or as many other of the investors would be,
Right.
or CEOs and stuff like that. So I assume it gets just worse and worse as you get more busy and more advanced in your career. It's just like, what I care about has nothing to do with what 99% of people care about.
Right.
And then how do you do to have an intuition for what people want? And it's not just consumers, it's also like B2B customers, like
Right.
everybody. It's like they just have nothing to do with you. Like, how do
You
you
gotta
do to
you
figure
you
that out?
gotta hang out and spend time with them, right? If you're gonna research customers, actually go and see the customers, see how they act. For example, I get to observe young people at close quarters because my daughter is 19 years old and her friends come over, and I get to hear a little bit about their chatter and understand sort of how they're thinking about things. And it's a good reminder that the way they think about things is very different from me.
Yeah.
Or if I go to a market, because I still actually go to, supermarkets and things like that. And I don't just go to Whole Foods, right? I'll go to, I'll certainly do things like go to Trader Joe's, but I also go to Walmart because there's a lot of things that are cheaper at Walmart, and it's not that far away from me. It's the same distance as Trader Joe's. And being in a Walmart gives you a much greater appreciation for what regular human beings are like.
Okay, Chris, I'm going to wrap this up. So that it's the first time in forever that we've actually wrapped up on time. So
We're turning over a new leaf.
yes. So Chris, thank you for your time. Thank you to folks, to Franklin, who asked us a question in the comments. Thank you to our team, Brendan, Shlok, and Jeremy, for making all this possible. And thank you to our Patreon subscribers, patreon.com/blitzscaling. And see everyone next week.
See you next week. Looking forward to it.